Welcome, dear participants, to the last module of this course. In the previous module, we had looked at an emerging area in the studies of body language, and that was the digital body language. Today, we would look at two other emerging areas which are known as Gustorics, and secondly, the study of how silence communicates in interpersonal communication. Gustorics represents studies of food and taste. It looks at how taste can communicate different messages regarding our background, our preferences, our cultural background, etc. Food cannot be viewed simply as a tool for survival in professional context. It is important to understand the intercultural communication, and that is why it is also given an important place now in the diaspora criticism. When we look at the significance of food as a means of communication, we have to refer to those people who had pioneered this thought in the area of culture studies. I would refer to Roland Barthes, who has commented that food is a situation and it is closely related with our culture. I would refer to a very interesting article by Nevena Sejic. The title of her article is Understanding Culture, Food as a Means of Communication. In this article, she has quoted Claude Lévi-Strauss and Mary Douglas, who suggest that we can view food as adhering to the same practices as language as a cultural product. The commonality between food and language can be understood easily because food is also a code which expresses patterns about social relationships and cultural backgrounds. I would quote from this article: what we consume, how we acquire it, who prepares it, who is at the table, who eats first is a form of communication that is rich in meaning. Beyond merely nourishing the body, what we eat and with whom we eat can inspire and strengthen the bonds between individuals, communities, and even countries. So, from a domestic chore, the preparation and serving of food has entered the realm of professional communication, and we look at several meetings being conducted over a lunch, during coffee breaks, etc. And therefore, food is a means of communication which, among other things, can also convey the status we want to communicate, our attitude towards other people, by the manner in which we order and we select our food items. The levels of formality which we want to maintain in our dialogue can also be communicated with the help of food and its associated practices. At the same time, food helps us to create a particular ambience as a part of our professional dialogues. It also communicates tradition, a sense of welcome, and can easily represent close bonding, the fact that we care for a person or we simply want to maintain formal terms with the other person. Therefore, we have to understand that food suggests an attitude of pleasure and appreciation as well as displeasure, animosity, or even a hidden warning. Because of these reasons, we find that food studies are fast becoming a part of nonverbal messages. So, what becomes important in this context is what exactly does food communicate to us, and secondly, how do we understand the communicated message. Food is multidimensional, it shapes us, it shapes our identity, it shapes our social values, it is a part of our cultural growing up. What we eat and how we eat is an essential part of who we are as a people. At the same time, how food is presented in words and images, in literature, in our day-to-day dialogue, in the photographs which we share on social media, etc., is also important. For example, coffee is now associated more with the idea of taking a break than with taking a drink for nourishment. Because of these clues, we can easily say that this dimension of nonverbal communication is at least as important as the messages which we receive through our dress, the color codes, etc. It also helps us to achieve collective self-esteem and group solidarity. Our choices in the context of food and our preference suggest several clues in interpersonal dialogue within the same culture as well as in cross-cultural situations. They easily suggest class. For example, a particular topping on a pizza signifies our taste in Italy, whereas ordering a frozen pizza in a supermarket signifies a fast and cheap home cooked meal. At the same time, it also suggests societal and cultural preferences. For example, seaweed may be preferred as a source of protein by the Japanese people, but the American people may not necessarily have the same choice. Some people may be surprised to note that in Western cultures, for example in America, corn on the cob is eaten, whereas in China it is considered basically as a food for domestic animals. At the same time, national tastes are also reflected in those food items which are popularly consumed. We find that it is common in different types of American foods to have sugar. On the other hand, in France, sugar does not have the similar role in the preparation of food items. So, food is an intriguing lens. At the same time, it helps us to analyze the communication patterns of the other people by telling us significantly about the social and cultural setups of the individual. The universal need for food ties individuals and groups together. Its preferences and regime change over time. Through the passage of time, we find that the preferences within cultures keep on changing, and these changes imparts important messages. For example, they can tell us about the historical development of a country, the geographical regions where a particular food item is preferred and why. At the same time, it gives us clues about the migration within and across societies, and gradually we find that food becomes a reflection of our national identities also. At the same time, we find that food is linked essentially with rituals and with culture. Ritual can be defined as a voluntary performance of appropriately patterned behavior to symbolically effect or participate in the serious life. Rituals which involve food are very important aspects of our routine and significant steps in our life. For example, our birthdays, our festivals, weddings, holidays, funerals are associated with a particular type of the preparation of food and how it is served. Within ritual contexts, food often stands in its expressions of life, love, happiness, and grief. We find that this aspect of food as a representation of culture as well as our emotional preferences within relationships has been portrayed across different types of media. I would particularly refer to its portrayal in a popular movie, Namesake. In this movie, we find that Gogol's changing preferences are reflected in his opting for a particular type of a food after the sudden death of his father. So, food as culture is related to tradition and nostalgia. It is also associated with the rhetorical repertoire of aesthetics, identity, and uniqueness. Food as a commodity is related to the consumption by people as well as it is associated with a particular industry. And at the same time, we find that it is an important message as far as the gendering of space in different cultural milieus is concerned. For example, if the preparation of food is linked with a particular gender, the space is also occupied by that gender only. The domestic kitchen in various cultures can be taken as an example which can be governed only by women, and men would not prefer to enter this space. The connotations which we have from food are important in the studies of body language because it imparts us various associations with the anthropological, sociological and psychological makeup of individuals in any professional situations. These aspects also clearly emerge in food communication and representation of food both in written and iconic text, on TV, in movies, in popular literature and mass media. We find that food has started to be interpreted as an independent language, as an important clue in terms of our understanding of body language. Like our dress, like the smells we wear, like the accessories we carry along with our body, the way we prefer our food to be eaten, etc., also has become a language which is important to understand in today's world. From the perspective of communication studies, food continues to be an important symbol in the creation of meaning. In the professional settings, food functions symbolically as a communicative practice by which we create, manage and share our meanings with others. Gastronomic tradition is dependent on culture and it is an unavoidable tool for learning about cultural differences. In today's multicultural settings at the workplace, this understanding has also become important. At the same time, we find that food and food related images are strongly related to our concept of territory and national identity. And therefore, talking about food or writing about food or representing various images related with food raise important cultural issues in international contexts. It also tells us about a culture's approach to life and what is valuable in a particular culture. Since our understanding of culture, habits, rituals and traditions which mold a working professional can be explored through food and the way it is perceived by us, this aspect of body language is now important for us. Another aspect which is interesting about this emerging area is that the communication related with food has an everydayness, and therefore it is increasingly becoming a part of literary criticism and communication studies in the context of NVCs. Further, we can say that the idea of the global village and the interracial workplaces has made this sensitivity almost a must skill which professionals today must possess. Now, in addition to paralanguage, we find that silence is also being studied as a part of NVC. Silence can be understood as a vocal absence of words or any associated voice, yet the way the silence represents our meanings is very subtle and yet it is resonant. Often we find that in certain societies and cultures, it may be associated with wisdom. The connotations of silence can be negative or positive. It can be an awkward and embarrassing pause, a lengthy pause when the speaker deliberately holds back the words. On the other hand, positive silence indicates confidence, respect for others, focus on what the person is thinking, and at the same time, maturity by suggesting that the person is not in a hurry to blurt out something. There are cultural differences also in the way silence is to be read as a part of our communication. I would refer to the researches of Edward T. Hall. We have referred to these researches in our studies of paralanguage also. Edward T. Hall has commented that in certain societies, and he has given the example of the American and British societies, words are important. So, in his opinion, the American and British societies are word cultures, whereas there are many other societies which rely more on open non-verbal cues and signs, which include silence also. In addition to understanding the cultural differences, our understanding of the context is also important so that the totality of the meaning can be correctly understood. Whereas some aspects of body language can be aggressive and suggest a violent temper, there may be some hand movements, certain postures, certain facial expressions which can be threatening and menacing. In comparison to that, silence is necessarily considered as a non-violent communication, even though it may suggest negative connotations, but violence is never one of them. If we look at the positive interpretations of silence, we normally interpret it as a sign of respect towards the other person who is speaking, or a desire to leave an option to the other person by remaining silent. At the same time, if the speaker wants to focus on how to frame the reply, the speaker may also prefer to remain silent for a couple of seconds. It can help us in planning our answer properly. In interpersonal interaction, we find that it can be used as a very effective strategy for controlling the audience. It signals emphasis on the points which the person has to speak after a silence, and in these contexts it can be linked with caesura, a particular aspect of paralanguage which we have discussed earlier. At the same time, our silence can help the other person mark the difference in the discourse types and conversational styles, whether it is a question or a surprised expression. Conventionally, silence is respected in Eastern cultures and it is valued. At the same time, it is associated with certain negative interpretations also. Particularly in those cultures where words are important, silence is often related with the concealment of truth, passing on a fib. It is also interpreted as a sign of impoliteness, hostility, or even dumbness, a failure to provide an expected response to the other person during a dialogue. Longer silences during communication are also an effective tool and in different situations can be used to get the other person to share additional information. This is a very effective strategy in a dialogue between a superior and subordinate. It conveys thoughtfulness, even hesitation, and somehow encourages the other person to give you more information. In the preceding modules, I have discussed various aspects of nonverbal communication with you. In our assessment of body language, there are certain constraints which we have to understand, as well as certain boundaries within which our understanding of body language should work. Body language is always culture specific, and therefore in all my discussions I have tried to point out the cultural differences in the interpretations. Our understandings of race and gender are also culture specific, and often in interracial or cross gender situations, sometimes we may tend to rely upon categories and classes instead of responding to an individual. In any professional dialogue, for that matter, even in our personal dialogues, it often results in what is known as reference group beliefs or cognitive dissonance. It becomes a bias in our communication, becomes a barrier in effective understanding of the message, and therefore it is important that in our communication we do not rely on any understanding which is rather cliched. For example, we cannot associate a particular race as having a certain type of a behavior. We cannot also associate a gender as having certain characteristics and traits. These generalizations should never be a part of any professional understanding of body language. There have been various researches also in which differences in gendered preferences in terms of body language have been commented on. Meticulously, I have tried to avoid it because I feel that we are consistently and happily moving in the direction of those workplaces where these differences are not important anymore. Therefore, stereotyping as a habit should always be avoided in the context of interpreting the body language of other interactants. The significance of body language has often been commented on in our appraisal of the other person, and therefore it is important for us to exhibit our body language in a positive manner. All of us are aware of the significance of body language in our professional world. A positive body language indicates interest, openness, enthusiasm, and enhances the communication also. On the other hand, negative body language impairs the professional image, and at the same time, as researchers have pointed out, it leaves a negative impact on our mood, on our stress levels, ultimately resulting in the diminishing self-esteem. And therefore, it is important to learn positive body language and control the negative aspects associated with it. Controlling our body language does not mean that we have to learn to be deceptive in our behavior towards other people. We have to remember that with our body language, we cannot lie. Beyond a space of 2 minutes, the other person can easily find out if we are trying to fake a positive body language. But several aspects of our body language are like old habits, and therefore we can unlearn these habits and learn more positive aspects associated with the kinesic communication. Even though our body language is mainly unconscious, we can identify certain negative habits and learn to replace them by a more positive aspect of body language. Latest scientific researchers have pointed out a close connection between the body language and our self-image, suggesting that by changing our body language, we can also change our thinking. It is interesting to note that this awareness has existed in literary criticism even prior to these scientific researches. We remember Foucault for his analysis of power, which is basically a non-economist analysis of power. We have also referred to Foucault in one of the previous modules and have referred to his idea of panopticism. Here I would refer to his second lecture, which he had delivered in Collège de France in 1976. In this lecture, he had questioned how power is exercised. Without going into the details of Foucauldian argument, I would simply point out to a particular statement which he had made, wherein he had suggested that discipline and training can reconstruct power to produce new gestures, actions, habits and skills, and ultimately new kinds of people. The association in controlling the body language to control the human mind has been commented on by Foucault in this lecture, and we have already seen how this idea has been reinforced by recent scientific researches. In order to control our body language, there are certain steps which we should consciously take. The first step, of course, is to be aware of the negative traits which we may possess as far as our body language is concerned. We should review our own mannerisms, postures, gestures, gait, facial expressions, tonality, etc., and consciously identify those areas which require certain change. We can take the help of the preparation of videos. We can take the help by preparing certain videos, by taking certain photographs also. At the same time, we can study the body language of those people who, in our opinion, are better communicators. We can learn to emulate gestures of people who have more positive body language. I would also refer to NLP or Neuro Linguistic Programming in this context, which is an effective tool as far as learning new or more positive aspects of body language is concerned. The idea of NLP was started in 1970s by Richard Bandler and John Grinder. They were trying to model behavioral patterns to obtain excellence. NLP delves into the relationship between the mind, that is the neuro, the language, which is the representation of linguistics, offering how these interactions impact our programming or behavior. NLP encourages us to look at models instead of looking at role models. For example, if we look at a carpenter who is excellent in his profession and we watch him working with his tools, we would find that there are certain things which he may do in a conscious manner and can teach us about these tricks. At the same time, while he is concentrating on his work, he would also be taking certain steps in an unconscious manner which would make him an excellent carpenter. We should focus on these unconscious behavioral patterns and try to emulate them, and it is this aspect of NLP which helps us to learn more positive traits of behavior as well as body language by looking at those people whom we want to emulate in our behavior. Certain other steps include mirroring, for example, studying the posture of other people, looking at the micro expressions of other people, and then subtly mimicking them. But it has to be done in a very conscious manner, otherwise the other person may feel insulted. At the same time, we should not be overwhelmed by this process of perceived changes. We can start by changing smaller aspects in our body language and can do it in a conscious and controlled manner. For example, we may look at a certain change in the way we position our leg while we sit in the workplace. We can start by changing smaller aspects related with our body language. For example, we may want to change the position of legs while we sit in our workplace, or we want not to use a particular hand gesture, or we may like to remember to have more smiles or maintain a better eye contact in our conversation. These aspects can be singled out and can be practiced easily, and gradually we find that practice enables us to have a better body language. At the same time, we can also imagine situations in which we may be expected to practice a particular kinetic aspect. Relaxation in public would also enable us to have a better control on our body language during our interaction. We should also develop the habit of avoiding verbal pauses, filling our answers with pauses and expressions like ems, using a meaningless word repeatedly, basically, positively, surely. So, these repetitive tics in our behavior communicate that we are not prepared and we are not confident to pass on a particular message. Annoying distractions, for example, clearing our throats repeatedly or sighing deeply, should also be avoided in our communication. These tips may help us in overcoming the negative aspects related with our body language. This aspect can be further understood with the help of this interesting video. It is about how political leaders make gestures when they react to certain events. This video has analyzed the body language of the Russian leader Putin, and it's a very interesting analysis.
As foreign policy analysts try to figure out what Vladimir Putin's next move is, the best clues may lie in his body language. As first reported by USA Today, there's a group of Pentagon researchers whose job it is to study the movements and gestures of foreign leaders, including Putin. Experts say studying a person's nonverbal cues can offer insight into how they make decisions and react to events. Some argue studying Putin's body language could help determine his intentions in Ukraine. On Friday, the Pentagon acknowledged such research but says it hasn't made a difference in the administration's decision-making on Ukraine. Still, that hasn't kept other body language experts from looking for clues in Putin's most recent press conference.
He does a chop, and that chop with his hand is very aggressive. It's like a karate chop. It's very aggressive. He's trying to intimidate us with his nonverbals.
A professor at Texas Tech University who researches nonverbal communication explained to NBC Putin spoke calmly, even though what he was saying was pretty combative. His demeanor is deceptive precisely because it doesn't appear outwardly belligerent. Perhaps because he's had some training. Alan Pease is a body language expert who has worked with Putin. Pease told the Moscow Times one of the first things he taught the former KGB officer was to quit using the type of aggressive gestures you'd see in former Soviet politicians. He added, "There is one specific type of body language used by Russians, mostly men, and by no other nations. That is a Soviet face, Mr.
A very important aspect which is essentially related with the way we interpret body language of others is that it is always interpreted in clusters. Whether it is an inclusive body language or non-inclusive, whether it is a face-to-face interaction or parallel, or whether it is congruent or incongruent, we have to understand that an isolated gesture, posture, eye smile, etc. is like a word which may have different meanings. If there is a combination of two or more kinesic signals, it becomes a sentence. At the same time, if we find that the dimension of time is also associated with our looking at the other person's body language, it becomes like a paragraph. This understanding helps us to avoid hasty conclusions. We should never be in a hurry to conclude about the intentions or feelings of the other person simply by looking at an isolated kinesic movement. Awareness about context and cultural frameworks is equally important. Though NVCs can be studied individually in terms of separate encoding and decoding processes, for example, we can look at eye contact or a particular gesture and can try to decode it. The dynamic nature of nonverbal communication is best studied during interactions only, and therefore this parallel with linguistic meaning in terms of word sentences and paragraphs has to be kept in mind whenever we look at the body language and try to interpret it in others. During this course, I have attempted to delineate the nuanced details of body language, and body language is an omnipresent phenomena of our daily professional life. So during this certification course, I have attempted to delineate the nuanced details of body language, which indeed has become an omnipresent phenomena in our daily professional life. Over the weeks in different modules, I have tried to look at different messages which are communicated through our body language, how we do send it, how they are shared in a non-verbal manner with others, and under what circumstances their impact matters. I have also tried to explain and evaluate the significance of body language vis-a-vis our sense of space, touch, time, smell, facial expressions and appearances, and also focused on the emerging areas of exploration, namely Gustorics, silence and digital body language. These discussions have to be understood in the context which has been specified in the very beginning of this course. Body language is a very significant aspect of our communication. The communication never becomes complete unless and until we also take body language into configuration. At the same time, there are certain limitations to it, and these discussions should be understood within the context which has been specified in the very beginning. I hope that it has been a meaningful course to you. I have enjoyed teaching it. Thank you.